Steve.
There you go. That looks good.
There's visitors here tonight.
Dang, that looks good.
I know.
All right.
That's why I get paid.
But anyway, let's see. Go through this stuff. Y'all know about the Bibles. Everybody here's pretty much ready. If you would like a study Bible, there's a box of study Bibles there. They're free. Take one. If you want to, it's on the cart right here next to the camera. But yeah, I'm just pointing off into space. There's another big box over there. That's not it. But there's a bunch of Bibles in there. If you got a buddy, friend, anybody you want to give one to, whatever, take as many as you want. I'll replace them. There's also a good little book. It's an easy read. It's really cool by Sean McDowell in there. More Than a Carpenter.
I could pass them out to my closings whenever I close on a house or something.
Yeah, man. Grab as many as you want. I'll keep you in supply.
Okay.
He'll be your supplier.
Oh yeah.
Other than that, y'all know about the black box. Just don't forget about the topics. If there's anything you want to see, you can. I mean, I think everybody here is comfortable talking and bringing it to us. Anything you want to see, if you want to teach anything, write it down, put it on there. If you have any ideas for the group or anything, you don't want to bring it up in front of anything, you can write anything on it and throw it in there. Like everything else, donations are going to go to food, snacks, coffee, all that stuff. There's a QR code on the front if you want to donate online. It's tax deductible. It's going through the nonprofit. But I think that's about it. Anything I forgot? Does anybody have any prayer needs or anything going on that you'd like to talk about? I think we hit a bunch of stuff already, but no. Anybody want to open us in prayer? Man, you got the look, man.
He's got the look.
Dane's praying for us.
Heavenly Father, Lord, we meet you here today. Just ask that you'll be with us as we go through this topic together and allow us to have good discussion, allow us to be able to learn tonight. And we love you, Lord. In your name, amen.
So last week we talked about where the Bible came from, how it was passed down from oral tradition, and then once the written technology came into existence, how it began being written down, how copies were made, and then we also covered, how there's thousands of manuscripts in existence, which allows scholars to compare them all, contrast them, and that way we can rest assured we have an accurate copy of the Bible as it was originally intended to be written. It hasn't been changed, and we know that. Any changes that have seen, y'all remember talking about this, the errors that were seen or things that were added, scholars could easily pick those out. None of them changed the meanings of the text as far as like significance of meaning or anything like that. The example we used was that passage in Acts chapter 8. Basically, it's one of those missing verses that's not so missing. They believe it was added later, verse 37. How more than likely a scholar was copying a copy of Acts. And it's a story of Philip encountering a eunuch, sharing the gospel with him, and he says, "Hey, I want to be baptized." And more than likely that scribe that was copying the scroll read the account, got to that one point and said, "Hey, this guy never makes a profession of faith." And so he probably added some kind of profession of faith in the margin, and then as more copies were made, it was probably included. But because we have the really old manuscripts that are closest to the original date, we know that's not original. And that's just an example. And that's why if you ever hear anybody talk about missing verses in anything other than the King James, it's not necessarily true. Nobody's trying to deceive you with missing verses or anything. And those verses are even in the modern translations. Most of them include them in the footnotes or in brackets. So we can rest assured that our Bible that we have is accurate. We can trust it. It's the Word of God. And now when we get to this point, now that we know that the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek is stuff that we can trust, we have to figure out how in the world do they get it from Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek to English. Have any of you ever gotten on a online translator or anything and tried to have a conversation with somebody? Did you ever do that when we were at PD? Like put the computer on the trunk? And how well does it work?
Not well at all.
Yeah, not well at all. Because you would think it would be just a matter of like typing in what you want to say, and then it usually comes out a jumbled mess. Because it's not necessarily as simple as going through and translating each individual word, because different languages order things differently. Some languages, they don't have words for certain things that other languages do. Some languages are more complicated than others, like Greek, like the word agape. In the Greek, there's like 5 different words for love, when we really only have one, right? So they have 5 individual ones that mean specific things, when in America, like the way that we use the word love, like I can love my dog, I can love a cheeseburger, I can love my wife. Like they're all different types of love, but that word all means the same to us. So it complicates Bible translation a little bit. And if you've ever been to a Christian bookstore and you've gone down the aisle, how many translations are there to pick from? It can be overwhelming, right? Yeah. And this is probably one of the most common questions that I get with people trying to read the Bible. Usually it goes, where do I start? We kind of talked about that, one of the first weeks. And then the next question is, I have a King James version that's laying around. Is there anything wrong with that? And we're going to talk about that tonight, and hopefully we'll have some understanding about it. But do y'all want to go around, like what translations are y'all using in here?
ESV.
Yeah.
ESV?
I use King James, actually.
King James?
I got King James.
King James?
Well, I got King James and New King James. If I can't understand one part of the King James, then I'll
And if I'm in deep study, then I just go into my Bible, and like I said before, I'll change several different translations just to see what each translation how they interpret it.
And we'll talk about that a little bit too.
I go between the CSB and the E.
Yeah, CSB is good.
Yeah.
I've been reading that every now and then.
Yeah, and I know this church uses the NIV. That's what their pew Bibles are.
That's why I grew up.
Yeah.
That's what I grew up using too.
So good. We got a couple different varieties in here.
We were in here one time when he was teaching the youth, and I said, the NIT, and he was like, that's a basketball tournament. I was like, oh. I meant NIV, but I was still in basketball mode, so I said NIT.
Well, another question. Have you ever gone through the Bible app and looked at all of the translations?
there's
probably is an NIT.
There's some crazy
Yeah.
stuff in there. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, we're gonna look at some here in a little bit in my Bible app, but I was just going through and downloading a bunch of them from the list, and it's just there's all kinds of stuff. And even as I was putting this together, I was updating the best-selling versions translations, and there were some on there I was like, what is this? I've never heard of this before. So there's so many different translations, but hopefully if you haven't been in a class like this before, hopefully after this it'll take the mystery out of it, might ease any concerns you have about picking a translation, and you can rest assured that what you have is probably all of the translations in here are good anyway. As long as you have a reputable translation, one of the big sellers for the most part, you're in pretty good shape. There's a couple coming out now that are kind of shady, but we'll talk a little bit about that then.
Watered down.
Yeah. We talked about this already. The Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek are where the original manuscripts came from. So unless you can read one of these languages, you've got to get an English translation. And before we get into the actual talking about the translation, we need to actually understand what translation is. Because a lot of times we think of it as just as something as simple as, translating individual words into our language, but it's more than that. The actual definition is a process where text in one language is not just word for word changed into our language, but it's transformed. I like that word because it involves a lot more than just changing it. But it's transformed into the equivalent text in another language. And that's what an accurate translation is. Because you want it to be readable, understandable, but also equivalent. Because if it's not equivalent, then you got some issues, right? You lose the meaning. A little bit of history of translation through time. Anybody heard of the Septuagint before? Yeah, because you've been to a ministry school. But it was one of the first translations from the original languages, and it was basically just translating the Old Testament into the Greek. It was done about 130 BC, so before Christ was born. And this is more than likely what a lot of the people were using in the time of Jesus, because they spoke Greek at that time. The Vulgate was the next one that came around, and that was done by Jerome. He actually translated it into Latin. And then John Wycliffe. Anybody seen a Wycliffe Bible or heard of a Wycliffe Bible? Yeah. That's because it was the first translation into English, and it was a Middle English translation in 1382 AD. And that's what, my math's not great, but 4,000 and some years before the King James Version. So that's the first glimpse into an English translation that we get. And then Gutenberg. Who's Gutenberg? Gutenberg Press?
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, he didn't translate the Bible, but he invented the printing press. And this was a giant feat for making Bibles, obviously, because they no longer had to hand copy them. They could actually print them out then. And this was in the 1440s. And so for the first time, they didn't have to sit there with a scribe and a pen and, actually write it out. And then, of course, the King James. And the original 1611 King James is called the 1611 because it was translated in 1611. And it was actually, the process that was used to translate it was somewhat similar to what they use now to translate things, but it was commissioned by King James. That's why it's called the King James Bible. Blows your mind, doesn't it? It's amazing.
I didn't know that.
It makes sense though, doesn't it? The 1611 and the King James. But the Bible, and actually up until, the Bible is the best-selling book ever. Billions have been sold. But the King James was actually, I think it's still the all-time bestseller. But until here recently, it was still the bestseller as far as Bibles go. But it's been bumped down a little bit on the list here recently, but it's still a very popular translation. Y'all still with me? Mm-hmm. All right. So translations today, and this is just a small bit. I literally just went on Christian Book's website, and this was a bunch of the major translations that they have. Because if you go on there, it suggests a bunch of the most popular ones. And then if you really want to look for some stuff, go into actual search by translation, and there's a ton of different translations, like your Bible app. But these are a lot of the more popular and more recent translations that are out there, like the King James, the New King James, the Christian Standard Bible, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which is the older version of the Christian Standard Bible, the New English Translation, the New International Version, all of us have heard of that, the NLT, the New Living Translation, the ESV, and then we have the 95 NASB, New American Standard, the 2020 New American Standard.
Explain that. What did they...
We'll get to it.
Okay.
No, that's a good question. I did that on purpose. I was hoping somebody. But, and then a more recent one is the Legacy Standard Bible. It was commissioned by John MacArthur and the Reformed Baptist Circle. And then we have the Message, and it's kind of deceitful because it's not really a translation, but it's up here.
It's like a paraphrasing.
Yeah. But it's one of the most popular Bibles that's sold today. Here it is by sale. So you're going to recognize the NIV is still, it's now the most sold Bible in America as of 2022. Then the New Living Translation, the ESV, and then the King James. And up until pretty recently, the King James was number one. I think the year before it was number 3 maybe. So it's still super popular. The CSB is a newer translation. It was basically rebranded and put out there kind of like a new translation. But we'll talk a little bit about why that happened. before we're done. But and then you have the New King James Version, which is an update of the King James Version. And then you have, I don't even know what number 7 is.
What is
The
that?
Reina Valera. Yeah, I don't know if it's a Spanish version or what. We can look at it in the Bible app in a minute. I had never seen the New International Reader's Version either. And I believe it's like a paraphrase, kind of like the Message. It's like an easier to read version of the message, or not of the Message, but of the NIV.
NASB is that low on the list? I didn't know that.
Which one?
NASB is pretty low.
Yeah, the NASB is losing popularity.
Really?
But
I have a question.
yeah,
Why is there so many different ones? Like, why can't
different
we-
translations.
Like, why couldn't we just kind of?
Excellent.
Eileen, so why are there so many different coffees?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It just comes out
Yeah.
of preference.
A lot of it is the King James obviously was like, it's like the OG. It's been around forever.
That's why I like that.
And then but a lot of translations essentially come from a translation philosophy that somebody gets in their head, and they say this hasn't been done yet or hasn't been done well. I want to see this done. And some of it is led by publishers, like Christian publishers, like the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the CSB. Like they're a Lifeway translation. Like Lifeway commissioned the translation with those. Because the CSB is an updated version of the HCSB. And we'll talk about the updates and why updates are necessary too in a minute.
Reina Valera is the most popular, most widely used Bible version in Spanish-speaking countries. It's the
Okay.
Spanish equivalent of the King James.
That's what I was.
Yeah.
That's what my guess was. But different people, like for instance, the Legacy Standard. Most people haven't heard of that, but basically John MacArthur. Have you heard of John MacArthur, Baptist guy? He's an older Baptist pastor, Southern Baptist, and he was like strictly a 1995 NASB user. He loved the NASB because he wanted a translation that was like the most accurate to the original text. And we'll talk about the translation philosophies and what that means in a minute. But he also thought that it was important that like if you don't know, anytime you see Lord in all caps in most translations, that is where in the original manuscripts the name Yahweh appeared. It's not Lord, but they didn't want to include Yahweh originally because a lot of people, like Jews for instance, wouldn't pronounce the name. And so they made it capital L-O-R-D or caps L-O-R-D. And so one of the things that he did with the Legacy Standard was he updated the 1995 NASB, but he also changed every instance where Lord was used to Yahweh. And by doing so, he claims that it makes it more accurate and easier to read and things of that nature. And so a lot of people that go to his church or that are in that Reformed Baptist movement, they switch to that version. A lot of people like in a lot of like the Baptist seminaries, stuff like that, they use the ESV version a lot. So you'll see a lot of people using the ESV that come out of there. But the ESV is another translation commissioned by a Crosspoint publisher. So that's where a lot of our new translations are coming from. A lot of it is publishers. Zondervan, it's a publisher. I think they do the NASB and the NIV.
They do the NIV. I know.
They do the NIV. So a lot of it is basically your publishers and stuff because they own the rights to it. So then they print the Bibles and they sell the Bibles. So like if you want an ESV, for the most part, you have to buy Crossway unless you buy a Bible that somebody's paid them royalties to print. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I guess.
But the biggest concern is the translation philosophy used when translating it to make sure it's still a reliable translation. And any of these big name publishers like Zondervan, Crossway, they do a good job of assembling teams that stick to the original manuscripts as close as they possibly can. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it does. I was just wondering, like, since there are so many, I mean, don't they? Does anybody kind of worry that the words might not mean the thing?
A lot of people do, but we'll talk a little bit about how they're put together and how we know they're reliable. The biggest deal is that you stick with the major translations. And if you actually open to the front of your Bible, I haven't looked at the King James, but like in the front of my Bible, like an ESV, what you're going to find is, and I mean before Genesis even, you'll find the table of contents, and then typically there's going to be an explanation, a preface. And part of this, what you're going to see is translation legacy. It talks about translating, and then the translation philosophy. And most Bibles in the front are going to have a translation philosophy in there. And we're going to talk about translation philosophies in a minute, but it's going to basically explain like this was the goal when we set out to make this translation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess, I was just confused because I know some Bibles will say like the first day, some will say a first day, some will say
and a lot of them,
day.
and a lot of them they may have footnotes as well with, and that's one of the reasons why the NET became really popular, because as a lot of the scholars actually translate, they'll actually make like translation notes where it'll talk about like if a word is really complicated to translate, like they might have 2 pages of notes on it.
Yeah.
And the NET actually like includes all those notes in there. So like Genesis 1, you open it up and one that includes the notes, and you'll have like one verse and then it's nothing but notes. It's crazy. And the Bible looks like a phone book.
Yeah.
But it's really cool to read the notes if you're really interested in that
Will
stuff.
has one. Will, maybe.
But
He's got one.
and if you go, like, you can go in the Bible app, and most of those notes are included on the Bible app, I believe.
Yeah.
But, and hopefully, I think as we progress on and we talk about, like, translation methods and stuff, I think it'll help you understand some of it, too. But if you have questions about it, like, keep asking, because I want to make sure I get your question and understand what you're asking. But this is basically what we were just talking about. When any modern translator sets out to translate the Bible, what they do is they start out with a method or a goal. And typically there's 2 different methods, word for word and thought for thought. And then paraphrase is the third one listed there, but it's something completely different. It's not really a translation. Word for word is, do you know what a linear Bible, have you ever seen a linear Bible? It's basically like the original Greek, and then under each word it will literally, it doesn't do anything to help make it readable at all. It will literally have like the English word for that word that's on top of it. And so it's hard to read, but it's good if you're like studying Greek or something, and trying to figure out what Greek word goes with what English word, stuff like that. But word for word, what it does is it tries to literally word for word translate as accurately as it can to each individual word. And they use less, they put less emphasis in making it readable. They want to make it extremely accurate to the original text. Does that make sense? Because anytime you translate anything, you kind of have to change it a little bit to make it readable. Not necessarily change the meaning, but you have to actually like change the sentence a little bit to make it readable. Thought for thought, it's not concerned as much with literally translating each individual word as accurately. It wants to convey the thought of the sentence more accurately, but also in a way that's readable and easy to understand. And then the paraphrase is basically a guy that goes through and he reads, a lot of times they'll read an English translation and they basically rewrite it in their own words. It's like paraphrasing that you would do if you're writing a research paper or something like that. Paraphrases are like the Message and the New International Reader's Version. They're good because they're really easy to read, and a lot of times they're very artistic. They flow really well. Like the Message was written by a poet, essentially, and so it's really smooth. The problem with it is you don't necessarily want to read it and study it for your in-depth study, because it's got a lot of that author's interpretation in it. Because anytime you paraphrase something, you're including your interpretation as well. You're not just translating it accurately. Does that make sense? And this is, if you look at that diagram, yeah, I drew that myself. It's pretty awesome. But this is kind of your scale here. So word for word is on the one end of the scale. Thought for thought, it's really on the other end. And I don't know that I necessarily include paraphrase. A lot of the scales now are including paraphrase. But this is like as accurate as you can get to the original manuscript as possible. And your like a linear Bible would be down here, because it's literally just like one word translated into the English word, and then the next word translated into the English word, but it's not readable. Like you can't really use that for your daily Bible reading. Does that make sense? And then you have a scale here. And if you read any of these, like the NASB, it's got a reputation. It was really popular, especially in the 90s, because it was like the most accurate literal translation out there. And so a lot of guys that were really concerned with in-depth Bible study wanted the NASB. And then the ESV came around, I think, in like the early 2000s, maybe.
I was gonna say, I always heard that the KJV was the most.
Yeah, and that's actually not true anymore. It actually rides down here a little bit more. But if you actually, like I have a copy, I use the NASB and the ESV a lot, because a lot of the guys that I'm around use the NASB, so I keep one close at hand. And honestly, like if you read these two, there's not much difference in them. Like a lot of the sentences are almost the exact same. They may change a word, but they're really, really similar. The biggest difference that makes the King James stand out is the Old English, because it's hard to compare to these translations, because these translations are modern English. The King James, as you read it, which you get used to it if it's what you've used and you're comfortable with it, you get used to that Old English. But the problem that a lot of people have with the King James is you have to understand the original text, and then you have to kind of understand the Old English as well. So you almost have to like interpret it twice to get it to the way we speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but once you get used to it, people that have used it for a long time, and there's nothing wrong with using the King James, but it's still a good translation. And then you get to the New King James. All they did with it, as they updated the Old King James, they tried to make it a little more readable. And so it brings it a little more thought for thought, because they try to make it a little more readable, but it's still a very accurate text as far as being word for word. And then back, you have like the CSB, and even the CSB, if you read the CSB and the ESV side by side, they're not drastically different. When you're really going to start seeing differences is like the NLT, maybe the NIV. I don't have much experience with the NIV. The NLT, one of my coworkers uses it, and he'll read something in the NLT, and I'll be like, "Is that the Bible?" Because it's just that different, because of the way they translate it. It's extremely readable, but I'm used to reading like ESV down on this spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm used to KJV.
Yeah. And a lot of it is, and I'll skip to the end here, like the ultimate goal with this is like, what's the best Bible to read? Ultimately, the best Bible, as long as you're using a good reputable translation, and everybody that's in here is using a good translation. If you read it, like keep using it. But I'd also recommend like jumping around different translations, checking them out, because occasionally it kind of does you some good to switch your translation a little bit. Because you may get used to like reading, like if you read the Gospel of Matthew all the time, you get kind of used to it. And then you flip to a different good translation, and it might like bring something out different. And it kind of puts a different spin on the same thing, if that makes sense. It can help you bring fresh eyes to the text. And then down here, obviously, we have the paraphrase. And then you have the Message and like the New International Reader's Version, stuff like that. So y'all good there? I didn't lose anybody? All right. So this is an example of, we're using the New Living Translation, the NLT, for this explanation because they're really open about their process. It's easy to find out about how they, like the details of what they do, but the process is essentially the same on any of these big name translations. So the ESV, the NASB, they all kind of follow this same process. And if you look in the front of your Bible, it's actually going to give you the details of what process they use. And it'll probably have and if it's not in there, you can go to the publisher's website. It'll actually list all the scholars that have been involved in the translation. And you would be surprised how many of them serve on multiple teams. I was listening to a podcast with a Bible scholar that was on the ESV team not too long ago, and he was talking about how, I can't remember which order it was, but he was on one translation committee, and then he went right into another translation committee, but instead of being like word for word, the other one was thought for thought, and he was talking about how he had to kind of shift gears a little bit, but a lot of times they're the same scholars because you only have so many reputable scholars that are really invested. But the first step that they do when they're setting out, once they get their philosophy, is they build a team of diverse yet qualified Bible scholars. And by diverse, we mean denominations, theological perspectives, and backgrounds in the Christian community. Why would this be important? We've already kind of talked about it when we were talking about denominations a minute ago. Why do you think this would be important? Because they don't want like any kind of a denominational influence, right? Because if you're a diehard Pentecostal, and then you're with somebody that's like a diehard super traditional Catholic or like Reformed Baptist, like they're going to have very differing opinions, right? But if their goal is to come together and translate the Bible as accurately as possible, then that's ultimately the goal, right? So you may want those guys actually working together because they can accurately translate it. If you have a team that's full of nothing but like Pentecostal scholars, then you're probably going to end up with a Pentecostal twist, right? Because no matter how much you try to just translate it and just stick to the text, there's going to be some interpretation that kind of flows into it in the part where they make it readable. Does that make sense? So they want them to be diverse. They don't want just a bunch of people with the same perspective. Also things like baptism. If somebody believes in nothing but baptism by immersion, you're diehard Baptist. And then you get somebody that thinks you should baptize by sprinkling. That might influence how they translate passages on like baptism and stuff like that, right? So they want it to be diverse because they want the Christian community as a whole to be represented. Next, with the NLT, they took each book of the Bible and they actually assigned it to 3 scholars with proven expertise in this book or group of books. And what this means is if you go out and has anybody bought a Bible commentary before? Like a commentary on one book of the Bible? Yeah. You learn pretty quick, like there's certain commentators that deal with certain types of books. Like by types, I mean genres. Like some of them may stick to the Gospels. Some of them may stick to like the New Testament as a whole. Some of them might be Old Testament scholars. They go to the Old Testament. So they're not going to want a guy that's an Old Testament scholar that spent his whole life studying the Old Testament, translating a New Testament book, right? They're going to want him translating something like Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus because that's his area of expertise. He's spent his whole life studying that. And so they typically assign, and they get reputations too because that's how they get asked to write those commentaries to begin with, because a lot of times they're teaching classes on these books and stuff in college for years. And so when they write their commentaries, they've had years to study it and think about it, and then they just have to pull it all together and write the book. It's not that simple, but so once they make their committee with 3 scholars, what they do is they basically go through, they form a translation together, and then they actually review and submit their revisions to a senior translator. And the senior translator basically like goes through and approves it, kind of like reviewing reports at the police department. Like you had to submit your report once you wrote it. Your sergeant had to read it, and if he didn't like something in it, or you had a bunch of grammar errors or spelling errors or something, he'd kick it back to you, right? Because you want to make sure it's accurate, because you got to go to court. It's important to be accurate. Same thing with the Bible; they want it to be accurate. And so it was like it's kind of like a security feature built into the translation process. After they did this, they actually sent it to a style committee. And what the style committee did was they actually tried to make what these scholars came up with readable. And if you know, we were talking about this morning in class. We had a guy in our prophets class this morning. He's really good at like spoken word, poetry, stuff like that. Super gifted. This would be the type of guy you want on a style committee, because he knows how to put it together, make it readable, make it flow. If you read anything I write, it's blunt to the point. It's not entertaining. There's no style to it at all. It's basically like the notes and that's it. So they want to make it readable. And then once the style committee gets done with it, it goes back to the scholars again. Why do you think it would go back to them?
So they can approve it.
Yeah, so they can proof it. They want to make sure it's still accurate.
It didn't change,
And so they basically bounce it around that way, and together, once the style committee tries to make it readable, they come to a compromise as to how it's still accurate yet readable, and how it fits the translation philosophy. Everybody still with me? Good. This is the revisions. This is why we have a 1995, a 1971, and a 2020 NASB. And the NASB translation is what's being used here. The ESV, I think there's a 2001 version, and then maybe a 2016 or something. But part of the process of translating, that committee actually, they will set an interval while they're translating of how often they're going to revise the translation. And why do you think a translation would need to be revised?
New scrolls.
New scrolls? I mean, it could be. If like a discovery like the Dead Sea Scrolls, that could be really big, because that was in what, the 1940s. So honestly, I never thought about that. But if they have older manuscripts that they think are more accurate, that would be a great reason. What's another reason why you would probably need a revision?
The meaning of words actually.
English language has changed.
Yeah, the English language changed, and this is why a lot of people hate on the King James, because there were no revisions. It was there were. I don't remember, from the 1611 it was revised, but there's no interval where it's never really been updated. It's still Old English. But what they do is they go through, and these revisions are not changing the meaning of the Bible, but it's changing the English that they use to translate it as language changes. And y'all aren't old enough yet to see it, but I'm starting to see it now. Slang and all kinds of stuff like that changes over time. Like stuff I said in high school, if I said it now, you'd be like, what are you talking about?
Give us an example of that, what you said in high school.
Like what we were talking about in class is what was the good one we used? It dealt with the flag.
Yeah, I didn't know what it was when you said it. I was so confused.
Crap, what was it?
Something you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, I used it as an example, but they were like, I don't know what that means. And I'm like,
something has to do with the flagpole.
oh, if you raise Old Glory. If I'm gonna go out and raise Old Glory.
And they didn't know what
They didn't know what that meant.
They don't even know who Old
So,
Glory was.
so this is a great example. If I say I'm gonna go outside and raise Old Glory, Steve's gonna know what I'm talking about.
I've
But
never heard that saying before.
their whole class was like, "What are you talking about? What does that
So
mean?"
what do they say? Just raise the flag?
It means raise the flag, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did y'all think it meant?
I don't remember.
And I'm not hating on y'all, but
Well, I remember
it was a
Old
perfect
Glory,
example of
yes,
this,
but
though.
like I've never heard that saying before.
Yeah.
Someone
Or if
said
I
it.
say we've got to go do colors.
What?
Yeah, that's raising the flag.
Do they know what running up the pole means? Let's run it up the pole and see what happens.
Yeah, so these are perfect examples of why we need revisions of the Bible.
Put up a flag, right? Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, but Old Glory is a nickname for the flag. So you raise Old Glory, you raise the flag. But like as our culture changes, the English language changes.
Yeah.
And we don't really notice it so much until you're in a class and you say something and they're like, "What are you talking about?" But
it means you're old.
Yeah, kinda. But this can also be really controversial as well, because you get like the 1995 NASB. There's a lot of people that use it for a long time and they love that translation. And then in 2020 they came around and they revised it, and everybody's like, "I hate this. They changed all these meanings of words." And one of the things that they changed was the passage where Jesus said, he's talking to the disciples, he says, "I'm going to make you fishers of men." That's how it was worded in the NASB 95. In the 2020, they changed it to, "I'm going to make you fishers of people." And in a patriarchal society, "I'll make you fishers of men," you're like, okay, he's talking about, "I'm going to make you fishers of people." You're going to go out and you're going to evangelize to people. And we don't really think about that. But as language has changed and we become really sensitive to gender and stuff like that, "I'm going to make you fishers of people." And you can see how a lot of people with all of this stuff going on in our culture and everything, they're like, "Oh, they're taking the genders out of the Bible. I don't like that." And so they were like, "I'm not buying the NASB 2020. Another thing, as you take time, like if you grow up with a translation or you read through a translation a bunch of times, like it becomes personal to you. Like when you hear the word of God, like you hear it in whatever that translation is. Like how long have you been studying the King James?
Oh, life.
Yeah. So you know it really well. And if I'm reading something else, like when you picture the Bible, you probably picture it as the King James.
Yeah.
Like I went to seminary, and the first time I read through the Bible like multiple times has been with the ESV. So like I find myself, I'll use other translations, but I have a hard time getting away from the ESV because that's what I know when I read the Bible.
Question: do you know why they had an updated version of the initial release 6 years later?
I do not know that. A lot of times they set an interval out. Like you say, there might be scrolls found. There could be if they think they need a revision. We were talking about the Holman Christian Standard Bible changing to the CSB. All that was a big revision, but a lot of that also surrounded the Holman Christian Standard Bible wasn't very popular. And it kind of was associated with certain cliques. And so they basically, when they revised it to the CSB, they changed the name of it to the CSB and they relaunched it. And it actually became really popular. It's actually a really good translation.
CSB?
Yeah. That's the one, I give Lindsay one and she reads it all the time. I like reading it. It's easier to read, but like I said before, it's not that different from the ESV. It makes it a little more readable, but I think it keeps the integrity of the scripture really well. But so this is where our revisions come from. And if you go to the front of your Bible, I think it's going to be one of the first pages. Yeah, you typically, like mine right here, across from the table of contents, these are table of contents. Right here is all the publisher information. And what it does, it tells the model of the Bible. So this is an ESV Bible, copyright 2001 by Crossway, because they're the ones that own the ESV. And then it says ESV Text Edition 2011. So I have I guess that's one of the revisions. So this is the 2011 version of the ESV. And a lot of times if you go on the website, especially right after they revise it, a lot of times they'll actually have, the publisher will put out like a handout that's meant to like hang up in a bookstore, and it'll have side-by-side comparisons of like, these are examples of things that were changed. It won't have all of them there, but you can actually, most of them, if you really nerd out to it, most of them actually put out like an exhaustive list of every change made. So you can actually go through and you can look at every change if you want to. Personally, I'm probably not going to take the time to do that. But that's why we have revisions, because the English language changes. It's not because they're trying to change the Bible or mutilate the text or anything like that. But and this is something that, like, a lot of, if you misunderstand it, like a lot of the King James only crowd, they like to use this as a reason why the King James is the only one that's acceptable. This is one of their defenses, that and the missing verses in the Bible. But there's good explanations for both of them why neither one of them are concerned. So whether you use the King James or you use the NIV or ESV or any of these other translations, you still have an accurate text.
Simply said, the best version is the one you're going to read.
Oh, yeah. I don't care what, honestly, as long as you're reading a good translation, I don't care which one you're reading it, as long as you're opening it and reading it. And if you're not going to read a Bible at all and you get the message and you're going to read that, then I guess that's better than nothing. But I would not suggest it for in-depth Bible study. I would go with a more word for word if you can, but if you can't and it doesn't make sense, then there's nothing wrong with the NLT or something like that. Yeah, the pastor I work with, he loves the NLT. But I'm so bought into the ESV because like I said, when I picture the Bible, I picture it in the ESV. But as you'll see in a second, like a lot of the translations aren't as different as we think they are. So what you're going to see on the left, this is just Psalm 1. The first two verses highlighted there in yellow. And this is the Bible app. If you have the Bible app, it might look a little different because it's on a tablet. But if you go up here to the top, they might have showed this.
Yeah, I will say real quick, you can do this on the Bible app if you turn it the other way.
On your phone?
On your phone.
Okay, I didn't know that. I don't use it that much,
If you
honestly,
turn
for this.
turn it this way, you can do the same
But
thing you did.
if you tap this box here, it'll actually be two columns there. If you tap that, it'll open up another column, and then you can just change. And this is there's 70 English versions on here. So if you're thinking about changing, you want to check a version out, this is the best way to do it because it's free. And free is for me. But the first one, the Legacy Standard, this will kind of show you. See how different it is there? I don't know why there's an extra verse highlighted there. I might have highlighted it in the LSB. But like verse 1 in the ESV says, "Blessed is the man who walks in the counsel of the wicked, not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." And then over here in the LSB it says, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers." So like I said before, it's pretty much the same, NASB, ESV. If you continue to read it, you're going to find some differences here and there.
Yeah.
But they're pretty similar. I'll try to make this bigger so y'all can see it. Secretly so I can see it too. Can y'all see that? Where you're really going to see a difference,
NLT.
we can try, I'll try to go in order, keep it somewhat. Like here's the King James. So we've already read the ESV, still on the left there. I'll make this go down. There. So in the King James, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of the sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." So it's the same thing, right? It's just Old English. If you're used to reading this, like it's a joke with a lot of people, walketh, talketh,
Yeah,
But-
I'm used to reading that.
Yeah, but if you're used to it, and honestly, it works both ways. Because I've read the ESV so much, and it's a word-for-word translation. It's the weirdest thing. I can go to the King James now and read it, and I'm fine. I don't know how that happened.
Yeah.
But it's really weird. I guess you just get used to the Bible language as well. And that takes one of those filters off of it, makes it easier to read. But like the King James, it's a good word for word translation. The ESV is a good word for word translation. Do you have something?
Yeah, compare NIV, just for the fun of it. Compare NIV with King James Version.
The NIV's missing verses.
Know it.
There's your NIV.
Which one's it?
Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, nor stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. So it's saying the same thing again. See how close the meaning
Very
is?
plain, yeah.
The only thing that's really changed is the English is more easy to understand. So that team, the artistic team, has taken it and they've made it easier to read. But it means the same thing, right? I want to try I downloaded all of these before and I don't know what happened to them. The NIRV, because I've never looked at the NIRV, the New International Reader's Version. I had to look it up. It's a bestseller now, though.
Very different. Than
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure this is a paraphrase and this is a translation, so this should be very different. It says, "Blessed is the person who obeys the law of the Lord. They don't follow the advice of evil people. They don't make a habit of doing what sinners do. They don't join in those who make fun of the Lord and His law."
Yeah.
So it's very, very easy to read, but it's not quite word for word what's going on there, but it's for the most part it's pretty accurate, right?
What was that one on the right you were talking about?
This is the New International Reader's Version, the NIRV.
Hey, can you pull the message up?
I
Just so
can't.
you can see how different it is.
I don't know my alphabet. How well God must like you. You don't walk in the ruts of those blind as bats. I thought that said something else for a
I
second.
thought
You don't stand with the good for nothings. You don't take your seat among the know-it-alls. And this is why I see how different that is.
Very different.
And what is that one?
This is the
That's the
message.
message.
So
Very
this
different.
essentially says the same thing that the ESV does,
But
but you can tell like there's a lot of his interpretation in this. And so this is why I would not recommend a paraphrase for like your daily study. You might understand, like, you might get some of the thoughts of God out of it or the big pictures. But as far as in-depth study, I would stay away from it.
it also adds a lot that doesn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah, it's just straight, like, you don't walk in the ruts. Like, there's nothing about walking in ruts.
Yeah, it's just not one.
It says you don't walk in the counsel of the wicked. He says you don't walk in the ruts of those blind as bats. I think this is more confusing than that.
It
I
is.
read blind.
No, I'm trying to read it.
Hey,
It's
I
like
will
confusing.
say-
I read that, that's what I
there's
read.
some passages.
What?
I can't remember what passage it
The profanity there?
When I read
saw
blind
it.
as bats, I added an extra S.
Yes, I did too.
I thought it
I
said
don't know
blind
why.
a bat.
I think
and I
it's
was like,
this, because I saw that too at
Yeah,
first.
right.
And
I
I
was
was
like,
like,
It's the
wow.
woke version.
I don't know why.
It's the one-
It's the woke
message
version.
The woke
is
version.
Oh my
Thug
goodness.
version.
Modern.
It is. It is.
Converted
It
thug
is.
version.
It is. Converted thug version. You're right about that.
but like, there's all kinds of stuff on here. There's a King James with Apocrypha.
Yes.
Hey, can you go to 3rd Corinthians?
Give me that trailer park version.
Third. No, what is it?
Here's
Colossians.
Here's
Colossians
the NET.
Colossians 3.
Colossians 2?
Remind me in a second. This is the NET that we were talking about with translators notes. See, this is the Bible app still. See all the what do you call those? The speaking bubbles from cartoons?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you bring this up and you tap on it, it'll include a lot of the translator's notes. So if you really want to nerd out, the NET is pretty cool because it actually like includes a lot of the notes of when they went through and translated. And it can really be interesting if you get to, like, if you're using a commentary and it talks about like a word that's controversial, or you see it notated in the footnotes of yours and says it can also mean this, or Hebrew meaning unknown or something. Like, usually if you go to this translation, it'll include a lot of detail about it. By using different translations too, we can also really improve our study with more. It gives us more resources as well, because this is free and you get all of these notes. I mean, look at all the notes, notations on there. like about every sentence has 2 or 3 in there.
Where is NET on? Is it more word for word?
It's pretty word for word.
Word for word, because it wasn't on that list that you made.
Was it not? I
No,
thought it was.
I don't think it was. That it's not on there.
No.
Where do you think it falls? You might not know.
I think it's over here with these guys.
Okay.
I think it would be red.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's red.
Yeah.
It's a good translation too, though. Again, if you put it,
Just if you get the Bible, like the physical Bible version of it, make sure you have space for it.
yeah, it's a fun book. It's
It's a
one
big
that would be
Bible.
good to own on an iPad.
Yeah. Keep at home.
But like it's worded, how blessed is the one who does not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand in the pathway with sinners, or sit in the assembly of scoffers. So it's a little more thought for thought, but it's pretty close. It's pretty accurate. What did you say? What did you want me to go to?
Colossians 3.
What shot?
Go
Verse?
down. Yeah, mainly verse 5. This is this passage right here usually is translated very differently.
So in the ESV it says, "Put to death therefore what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." In the NET it says, "So put to death whatever in your nature belongs to the earth: sexual immorality, impurity, shameful passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry."
You know, and I know I'm gonna be talking old school. When we were middle school, high school, we had a Bible come out called The Way, and it was controversial. And all it really was pretty much what you're talking about now. It was a language that kids in high school and junior high school could understand, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal to get those. I mean, we got in a lot of trouble for having those in the room. So they were donated, but it didn't go over very well. It caused a lot of controversy.
Yeah, and there's also another. Was it the Passion translation?
Yeah, that was very controversial.
The Passion is one where you should stay away from it as well.
Yeah.
And this is an idea of what an unreputable translation is. We talked about reputable. Like when you have a reputable translation, like you typically have a team of scholars that are, well vetted. They have a deep resume to go with them. They're qualified. I think it's the Passion. It actually is one guy, and he basically said that God told him to make his own translation of the Bible, and he was given fresh revelation. That should send up some red flags because he's basically changing Scripture, and he's interpreting it by himself. And I don't know if he knows the original languages, but he's not qualified to translate the original languages. I think he may be. I don't know what he's using. I don't want to speak out of
because of his stance.
Yeah, it became really, really popular, and then if you want to know more about it, there's a YouTube pastor, Mike Winger. He actually hired some like legit scholars to go through and like read the translation and like say what they thought, and he did it from a point of like, this is dangerous. I want to make people aware that this is misleading, and like he hired some big name guys to come in and look at it, and he actually interviewed them on his YouTube channel, and he talks about why it's dangerous and where it was messed up and stuff like that. So definitely be aware of the translation that you're using too. But most of the ones, any of them in this room are great. That translation, I know it came on the Bible app briefly, and I think they removed it since. So they do police the Bible app, at least a little bit. I don't know how much. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know a whole lot about the Bible app, but it can be a great resource if you want to compare stuff like this. Was there something else you wanted to see with this passage, or there's your King James? Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth: fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil. Yeah,
The-
the King James.
That's a big word.
Concupiscence.
Huh?
Concupiscence.
That was not made for a country guy to say.
No. Well,
It's like
mainly
Melchizedek.
the
I
me-
cannot. I have to really think hard to say his
The
name.
message says something really interesting in there.
From Genesis, Melchizedek, the
I have no
priest,
idea
the priest
what it
king.
I was like, I don't
What,
know.
what the message?
The message of this is pretty interesting. I read it the other day.
That means killing off everything connected with that way of death: sexual promiscuity, impurity, lust, doing whatever you feel like, whenever you feel like it, and grabbing whatever attracts your fancy.
It's just funny the way they word it.
And that's, and what?
That's the message. It's a paraphrase.
It sounds like a.
That was the way,
Like a
what you and I was
sermon.
reading.
Yeah.
Is the way on
You
here?
allowed to have the
Yeah.
way, Bible in your church. Yeah, a lot of people do.
Here's the Passion.
Oh, is it on there? Oh man.
What app are you on? What are you looking at?
Oh, this is the Bible app. And this is just one of the resources. I know Dane shared a bunch, and y'all talked about it a little bit, but this is just one of the reasons. It's kind of cool because if you're doing your daily study and like you read a paragraph or maybe a couple verses, like you can take a couple minutes and flip through, check out a couple different translations. But ultimately, like the more you read the Bible and the more familiar you get with your Bible, the easier it gets, because you kind of it's almost like a language barrier at first reading the scripture, but the more you're in it and the more you get accustomed to it, it's like speaking Spanish. If you have like a basic vocabulary, like it's gonna be really rough at first, and I'm not saying I speak Spanish but like the more you use it, the more you do it, the more you get fluent in it, and before you know it, like you'll be reading stuff and you'll understand it a lot better. You won't understand everything, obviously, or answer all your questions, but you'll be able to understand it a lot better. And then you'll be able to go to different translations that seem really, really foreign to you, and they'll actually make a lot more sense. But anybody have any questions? Anything? Nobody's more confused than when they got here, right?
Can we go through all of this again one more time?
Yeah, I'll email you this. All right.
Well, I learned tonight that you could turn the thing sideways and get side-by-side translation, so.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
I didn't either, and I read this thing all the time.
Or you have young people in the class.
Yeah, that's why you have the IT guy.
The IT guy taught me this.